I am 96 years old. At this stage of life, you begin to understand that time does not move the way you once believed it would. When you are young, years feel wide and generous. When you are old, you see clearly how quickly they folded into one another, how quietly entire decades passed while you were busy thinking you would start taking better care of yourself later. There is a man who lives across the park from me. He is in his late 60s and always seems to be rushing somewhere. Most mornings I watch him through my kitchen window, moving with that particular urgency modern life seems to demand. Coffee in one hand, worry in the other. Last autumn he told me he planned to begin walking every day. Just 30 minutes, he said. He had been meaning to do it for years. He said it in the same tone I have heard countless times across my lifetime. Hopeful, casual, postponed. I did not challenge him. I've lived long enough to know that people rarely change because someone older offers a warning. They change when life itself becomes impossible to ignore. Still, I have watched this pattern repeat so often that it now feels almost predictable. We assume we will have time to repair what we are slowly wearing down. I am not a doctor. I spent most of my working years in ordinary professions, living an ordinary life. But what age gives you, if you pay attention, is perspective. I have sat beside hospital beds. I have attended funerals that felt premature. I have listened to friends express genuine surprise that their health declined faster than they expected. What they often fail to understand is that decline does not usually arrive suddenly. It arrives as a quiet accumulation. The body whispers long before it is forced to speak loudly. The trouble is that modern life trains us to ignore whispers. We respond to urgency, to deadlines, to noise. We postpone what feels optional. The first thing people realize too late is the importance of sleep. When I was younger, I treated fatigue as something to push through. Staying awake felt productive, even admirable. I told myself that rest could wait until life became less demanding. Life, of course, never became less demanding. It simply changed its demands. Only later did I understand that sleep is not merely comfort, it is repair. During the night, the body restores itself in ways we barely notice when we are young. Memory stabilizes. Hormones regulate. Small damages are corrected before they become lasting weaknesses. When you consistently deprive yourself of this process, you are not just tired the next day. You are gradually reducing your capacity to remain strong in the years ahead. I watched my older brother live this truth without realizing it. He believed functioning on little sleep was discipline. By the time he reached old age, his resilience had quietly eroded. We called it normal aging. Looking back, I see how much of it was simply accumulated neglect. If you are tired now, do not assume it is harmless. What is common is not always what is healthy. Sometimes it is simply what many people have agreed not to question. The second thing people realize too late is that they do not truly know their own bodies. They live inside them, certainly. They decorate them, feed them, move them from one obligation to another. but they do not study them with the same careful attention they give to the devices in their pockets or the schedules on their walls. They know when their phone battery is low. They notice when an application begins to run slower than usual. Yet they do not know their resting heart rate. They cannot tell you what their blood pressure typically measures. They do not recognize the difference between ordinary tiredness and the kind that suggests something deeper is shifting. I learned this lesson in my late 70s, though the signs had been present long before that. I remember a winter afternoon when the sky seemed permanently gray, and I felt a heaviness in my thinking that I attributed to age. Conversations required more effort. Reading felt strangely demanding. I told myself this was simply the natural dimming of later life. It was not. A routine examination revealed a deficiency that had likely been affecting me for years. Something small, something correctable, something that might have been addressed much earlier had I been paying closer attention. I realized then how easily we accept discomfort as inevitable when we do not want to investigate its cause. There is a peculiar kind of avoidance that develops with adulthood. When we are children, we are curious about every sensation. We ask questions constantly. As adults, we become efficient at explaining things away. We attribute persistent symptoms to stress, to work, to getting older, to the vague idea that this is just how life feels now. Sometimes it is. Often it is not. To know your body is not to become obsessive or fearful. It is to become informed. It is to understand the baseline from which change can be measured. A slight irregularity noticed early is an opportunity. The same irregularity ignored for years becomes a crisis. I have seen both outcomes, often within the same circle of acquaintances. The third realization comes with movement. Not exercise in the dramatic sense people like to announce at the beginning of a new year. Not ambitious plans that last 6 weeks and are abandoned with quiet disappointment. I mean the simple daily act of using the body as it was designed to be used. There was a man I knew decades ago who spent his life seated. He worked sitting down, relaxed sitting down, traveled sitting down. He was not overweight, and so he assumed he was healthy. This assumption followed him faithfully until the morning his heart decided it could no longer accommodate his stillness. He survived, which allowed him to tell the story later with a kind of determined humor. But he once admitted to me that he felt he had misplaced years of vitality he did not need to lose. He had mistaken the absence of visible illness for the presence of genuine strength. The body is not built for prolonged immobility. Muscles weaken quietly. Circulation adapts downward. The mind itself becomes less resilient when the physical system that supports it is underused. You do not have to transform yourself into an athlete. You only have to move often enough to remind your biology that you are still engaged with the world. A walk outside changes more than your step count. It alters the chemistry of stress. It clears the static from your thinking. It reintroduces rhythm into a life that may have become too mechanical. Yet people postpone this simple act as though it requires ideal conditions that never quite arrive. The fourth realization concerns food, And this is a delicate subject because it touches not only biology, but comfort, habit, and culture. When I was young, meals were predictable in a way that now seems almost old-fashioned. Ingredients were recognizable. Portions were modest not by discipline, but by circumstance. We ate what was available and did not expect constant stimulation from what we consumed. Over the decades, I watched the landscape of eating transform into something far more complicated. Food became entertainment, reward, distraction. It became engineered in ways that encouraged excess without announcing the consequences immediately. The body, patient as always, adapted for as long as it could. People often ask me what they should eat to live longer. I tell them longevity rarely depends on a single miraculous ingredient. It depends on patterns repeated day after day. The choices made in middle age echo loudly in later years. Arteries do not suddenly harden overnight. Metabolism does not abruptly surrender without warning. These are gradual negotiations between habit and physiology. I am not asking anyone to pursue perfection. Perfection is exhausting and rarely sustainable. I am asking for honesty, to pause before a routine choice and consider whether it is nourishing or merely familiar, whether convenience has quietly replaced care, whether taste has become more important than function. The fifth thing people realize too late is that the mind and the body are not separate negotiations. They are one continuous conversation. Chronic stress, unresolved grief, persistent anxiety. These are not abstract experiences floating somewhere above physical reality. They alter the nervous system. They influence the immune response. They shape how energy is distributed throughout the day. There was a period in my life after a personal loss when I carried a subtle sadness that I considered normal. I functioned, I worked, I participated in the routines expected of me. But something inside remained heavy, and over time that heaviness translated into fatigue, disrupted sleep, and a vague disinterest in things that once brought me joy. It took me years to recognize that emotional burdens, when left unattended, eventually demand physical expression. The body insists on balance even when the mind prefers avoidance. Seeking help felt unnecessary at first. Later, it felt essential. I discovered that releasing long-held tension did not weaken me. It restored a kind of vitality I had forgotten was possible. The lesson here is not that life should be free of difficulty. Difficulty is inevitable. The lesson is that ignoring internal strain does not make one resilient. It merely postpones the cost. When the cost arrives, it often includes consequences that extend beyond mood into measurable health outcomes. By the time people begin to connect these dots, they are often older than they expected to be. They look back and realize that small, consistent acts of care would have altered the trajectory of their well-being. They understand that prevention is quieter than treatment, less dramatic, but infinitely more powerful. If there is one thing I have learned from observing nearly a century of human lives unfolding, it is this: the body keeps remarkably accurate records.
It remembers what you repeat. It remembers what you neglect. And eventually, it presents its conclusions with a clarity that cannot be negotiated away. The sixth thing people realize too late concerns alcohol, though it could just as easily apply to any habit that becomes so normalized it escapes honest examination. I speak about this carefully because I am not interested in judging anyone's choices.
I am interested in patterns, and patterns become visible only when you have watched enough years pass in front of you. When I was younger, drinking was woven quietly into the fabric of social life. Celebrations included it. Grief included it. Even ordinary evenings sometimes felt incomplete without it. The problem was not always excess in the dramatic sense people imagine. The problem was gradual escalation so subtle that no single moment seemed worthy of concern. I remember a colleague from my middle years who began with a single drink after work. It helped him unwind, he said. Over time, the ritual expanded. One became two. Two became three. His health did not collapse suddenly. It shifted incrementally, almost politely. He grew more tired. His patience shortened. His sleep became fragmented. By the time a physician spoke plainly about the condition of his liver, he was genuinely surprised. He had not noticed the slope he had been descending. This is how many health consequences unfold, not as dramatic falls, but as gentle inclines that feel harmless while you are walking them. When something is culturally accepted, we often stop evaluating it individually. We assume common behavior must also be safe behavior. Age has taught me that the two are not the same. The seventh realization involves avoidance, particularly the avoidance of medical appointments. There is a peculiar human tendency to believe that unexamined problems might quietly resolve themselves. We postpone consultations because we are busy, because we are afraid, or because we do not wish to disrupt the fragile comfort of uncertainty. I once delayed a routine check for longer than I care to admit. Nothing catastrophic resulted, but the experience left me aware of how easily fear disguises itself as practicality. We tell ourselves we will address the issue when life becomes less demanding. Yet life rarely becomes less demanding. Meanwhile, the body continues its silent calculations. I have known individuals whose outcomes differed dramatically based on timing alone. One friend attended an examination she had been tempted to postpone. Her condition was discovered early and managed successfully. Another delayed nearly a year, convincing himself that symptoms would pass. By the time he sought help, the situation had become far more complex than it needed to be. The lesson is not that we must live in constant vigilance. It is that courage sometimes appears in very ordinary forms. Making a phone call, scheduling a visit, allowing uncertainty to be replaced by knowledge. Action may not always bring good news, but inaction rarely improves reality. The eighth and perhaps most underestimated realization is the health of our relationships. Loneliness is often described as an emotional state, something poetic or abstract. In truth, it has measurable physiological consequences. Human beings evolved as social creatures. Our nervous systems respond profoundly to connection and disconnection alike. In my later decades, I began noticing how isolation seemed to accelerate decline in ways that surprised even those experiencing it. Individuals who maintained close friendships, who spoke regularly with family, who felt genuinely seen and supported, often recovered more quickly from illness. They carried a certain resilience that was difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Conversely, those who drifted into prolonged solitude frequently experienced subtle but cumulative deterioration. Appetite diminished, sleep grew restless, motivation faded. It was as though the absence of meaningful interaction signaled to the body that survival itself was less urgent. Modern life makes disengagement remarkably easy. We move frequently. We communicate through screens. We convince ourselves that occasional contact is sufficient to sustain bonds that once required daily attention. Relationships, like physical health, respond to consistent care. Neglect rarely produces immediate consequences, but over time it alters the emotional climate in which the body must function. I have spent many evenings reflecting on the friendships that endured and the ones that dissolved through simple inattention. Rarely were these connections lost through conflict. More often they faded because both parties assumed there would always be another opportunity to reconnect. Time, I have learned, does not guarantee such opportunities. Reaching toward another person can feel inconvenient in a world that rewards efficiency. Yet the benefits extend beyond sentiment. A conversation that feels genuine can calm the nervous system more effectively than many interventions we consider more sophisticated. Shared laughter, honest concern, mutual understanding, these are not luxuries. They are forms of biological support. As people grow older, they often look back with a mixture of gratitude and regret. Gratitude for the relationships they nurtured, regret for the ones they allowed to wither. They realize that emotional nourishment influences physical vitality in ways they once underestimated. All of these realizations share a common thread. Health is rarely determined by a single dramatic decision. It is shaped by the accumulation of ordinary habits. The glass poured each evening without reflection, the appointment postponed another month, the friend not called because tomorrow seems more convenient. By the time the long-term consequences become visible, they can feel inevitable. Yet inevitability is often only the final chapter of a story written slowly over decades. Understanding this earlier would change many lives. I cannot return to my younger years to apply what I now know. But you, listening at whatever age you are, still have the ability to alter the trajectory that is quietly forming beneath your daily routines. I am 96 years old now, and when you reach this age, clarity arrives whether you invite it or not. You begin to see your life not as a series of separate moments, but as a long, continuous pattern shaped by thousands of small decisions. What you chose to ignore, what you chose to face, what you postponed, what you protected. People often ask me what the greatest surprise of aging has been. They expect me to speak about loss or about physical limitations,
or about how quickly the years seem to accelerate. Those things are real, of course. But the deeper surprise is how predictable so much of it was. Looking back, I can see the early signals everywhere. The fatigue that was dismissed as busyness, the stiffness explained away as temporary, the friendships that slowly loosened their grip because both sides assumed there would always be time. Health, I have learned, is not something that disappears overnight. It shifts gradually, like light changing through the afternoon. At first you hardly notice. Then one day you realize the room is dimmer than it used to be. By then, reversing the process requires far more effort than simply maintaining what was once natural. If there is a single message I would offer you, it is this. Do not wait for discomfort to become crisis before you decide to care for yourself. Do not assume that because you feel functional, you are necessarily well. The body is remarkably patient. It will compensate for years. But compensation is not the same as strength. Eventually, every system asks to be treated with respect. I think often about the decades when I believed I was too busy to rest properly, too practical to examine my emotions, too certain that tomorrow would provide another opportunity to begin living more wisely. Tomorrow does arrive, of course, but it does not always arrive with the same resources you once possessed. Energy changes, recovery slows, choices narrow. And yet even now, I would not say the story is one of regret alone. There is also gratitude. Gratitude for the moments when I did choose well, for the walks I eventually made habitual, for the conversations I had the courage to initiate, for the times I listened to the quiet signals instead of waiting for them to become unbearable. You are going to grow older if fortune allows it. That is not a threat. It is a privilege. But the quality of that privilege is shaped long before you reach the later chapters. It is shaped by the ordinary mornings when you decide whether to move or remain still.
By the evenings when you decide whether to sleep or continue pushing beyond what your body is asking of you. By the phone calls you make, the appointments you keep, the habits you question honestly. There is still time for you. That is the simplest and most generous truth I can offer. Time to learn your own patterns. Time to correct course gently before urgency forces harsher adjustments. Time to build a future in which aging feels less like a sudden decline and more like a gradual, dignified transition. Use that time. Not someday, not when circumstances improve. Use it while the choice still feels easy.